Hello, a very warm welcome to Creative Bureaucracy Festival Meets Science. I'm Julia Stamm and I direct the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 10th and final edition of our digital conversation series, CBF Meets Science, that we convene in the context of Berlin Science Week. Over the past 10 days, we have hosted a series of digital conversations with leading experts covering a broad range of topics to take a closer look at the relationship between the public sector and science. And I'm absolutely thrilled to close our series with an exchange with Professor Karen Hussey, an accomplished academic turned policymaker and as such a wonderful interlocutor for our topic. Karen currently serves as Deputy Director General in the Queensland Government, Department of Environment and Science, and her portfolio covers everything from resource recovery and the circular economy to natural capital markets, climate change, water quality, coasts and wetlands, biodiversity conservation, and Queensland's contribution to managing the Great Barrier Reef. That's quite a mouthful, Karen. Prior to joining government, Karen was professor and the inaugural director of the University of Queensland Centre for Policy Futures, a policy-focused research centre that provided a focal point for the university's engagement with the public policy sphere. And we'll certainly talk about that as well. Karen, it's absolutely wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Julia, for having me. And hello, everyone. I wish I could have joined you in person, but this will have to do.
It will. We'll start with a question that I'm asking all my guests on this conversation series, namely, when you hear the words creative bureaucracy, what comes to your mind spontaneously?
I think being prepared to take a few risks. So public servants being prepared to be genuinely creative, which means doing something new, something that perhaps hasn't been done before, but pushing for the idea that we need to pilot things, we need to experiment, we need to controlled experiments would probably be where I would take it, because of course we have a fiduciary responsibility not to waste public money. But I think creative bureaucracy is about saying, there are new trends, there are new pressures, new constraints, new opportunities. So we need new ideas.
New ideas. That's what we're going to talk about. Karen, you're looking back at more than 15 years as an active academic. You trained as a political scientist, as an economist, and your research and training focused on policies, institutions, and governance arrangements for sustainability mainly. What made you change sides? I
very much wanted to be inside the tent, as we say in English. I had spent the better part of 15 years shouting at the tent or talking softly at the tent. But when I was approached about this role, it was the end of 2019. And some of you might remember that Australia was going through some very, very devastating bushfires. My own research had very much focused on environmental policy and climate policy. And I got a phone call about this role, and I just thought it was about time I put my money where my mouth was and got into the tent to see what it was like, how decisions are made, and whether or not there was a possibility for me to be part of that decision making and providing advice to the government about what best practice public policy would look like for environmental outcomes.
Yeah, so we'll be talking a little bit about this in particular. But first of all, I wanted to ask in a more general way, what is for you the role of and for science and policy making? Also, did this perception shift, from when you were an academic to now being in government?
I was quite an applied researcher anyway as an academic. So I had focused not so much on the fundamental research, but on the, how can we take the fundamentals and apply it to public policy. So I was probably more inclined towards joining government or going into the private sector than a lot of academics would be. If anything, the shift into government has just reinforced the view that I had anyway, which was that we needed to have much more fluidity and much more of a porous sort of barrier, if you like, between academia and where science and research is undertaken and where policy and investment decisions are made. So I I had enjoyed very rich, productive and constructive relationships within the Academy and with public policymakers in Australia, some internationally as an academic, but you never really know the way information is used and how best to use it and frame it and deploy it until you're in government, I think. When you're aware of the pace at which things happen. So there's I say to all of my academic colleagues now, first of all, you've no idea how hard public servants work. I'm not sure what it's like internationally, but certainly Australians, I think, would be quick to say that public servants are, you can't get into the lift at 5 o'clock because everyone's trying to get out of the building. It's not true. Public servants really work very hard. But the other thing is that there's a perception that governments take ages to do anything. And it's interesting because there are aspects of bureaucracy that is slow, turgid on occasion, but then it speeds up and all of a sudden things happen quickly. And I think it's at that point when decisions are about to be made, when the policy window has opened, that there is a tremendous opportunity for experts to be there to help shape that. And that's now very, very obvious to me now that I'm on this side of the fence.
Because you were talking, about the importance of, bringing in some fluidity also in the relationship between academics and the public servants and government work. So when you think of the relationship between science and policymaking, also to the transfer of scientific results, scientific findings into policy, what are the most important challenges for you in general, but also in particular, looking at your area?
Yeah. This won't make me very popular with researchers. In many ways, we don't need more research, right? For the world's largest, most intractable problems, we probably know what we need to know in order to be able to solve some of those problems. So the challenge is not an absence of research. The challenge is being able to articulate the answers in a way that is digestible, that is answering the question that's being asked at the time, not the question that you wish had been asked, not the question that was asked 3 years ago, but the question that's being asked today. Because policy is politics, and so I think the challenge of getting the science into the policy is in communication, it's in timing, it's in access. I've actually been incredibly heartened by the number of relationships that exist between policymakers and scientists in Australia. There is actually quite close relationships, or there are quite close relationships. And we bring scientists into the policymaking process in a very structured, systemic kind of way. But I think the challenge lies on the academy to find that balance between continuing to do the blue sky fundamental transformative research to make the world ready for us in 20, 30 years, while simultaneously being able to package up what we already know to answer the questions that are a problem now. And that was why I established the Centre for Policy Futures, was to try and get that to try to get the academy to think and operate a bit like a think tank.
In one of the other interviews that I was having with a guest, we spoke about the importance of intermediaries, people who translate between science and
Yes.
and policy. And I'm, when I look also at your work and what you've done with the Centre for Policy Futures at the University of Queensland, to me, this is exactly this kind of translation work. So maybe you can talk a little more about what you did in particular at the centre.
So the idea for the centre was very much grounded in the belief that the outstanding research, peer-reviewed research that is done in universities could be incorporated into public policy decision-making more readily. And in order to do that, you needed to have a shop front. Universities are notoriously difficult to navigate. So when you're a policymaker, who do you call? And if you go on any university website, frankly, it can be a little challenging. So I felt in the first instance, you needed to have a shop front, and it needed to very clearly scream policy. you also needed to have people who could communicate well. And researchers exist on a vast spectrum of different personalities and skills and expertise and talents and all the rest of it. But there's this number of academics who are very skilled at being able to take the complex and make it simple. And they're the people who I think your other interviewee were referring to when they say a translator or an intermediary. The other thing I wanted with the Centre for Policy Futures with my colleagues was to be able to provide some thought leadership. So this was to be able to say, well, we are doing quite amazing thinking in and across the academy. And here's how you need to think about it if you're a policymaker. And by definition, that means actually working with policymakers to know how they think, so that you can communicate it in a way that they'll understand. And that could be simple things around language. You know, are you using the buzzwords that they're having to think about? So that's language and crafting. And then finally, it was about relationships because, you know, we're social beings. And so one of the initiatives was to simply try to get researchers to interact more readily with politicians and public servants, you know, on matters of mutual interest. So we simple things like actually having an event at Parliament House so that you make it easy for the senior executives and for the politicians to come to an event, making it quick, having it on a sitting day, making clear that it's about something that's actually going to be discussed in Parliament then or very soon after. So it really wasn't rocket science, but it's probably something that I think was ready to be done.
Thanks very much. You already spoke about some of the tools or the things that you find important, you know, when it really comes to sort of building these relationships. I wanted to go a little deeper into what you did at the center. And I read that you've initiated, among others, a Policy Future series for the university's engagement with the government, with Parliament in Queensland, and also a policy impact program with the Churchill Trust. So I'm wondering, for people listening to us and really thinking about how to build, you know, successful science policy engagement programs, how did you go about this? How did you go about developing those programs?
It started from the conclusion that I had made, which was 90% of academics are focused on the research that they're about to do and the grants that they need in order to be able to do that. But that there's a tremendous amount of research that has already been done, and that could usefully be communicated. Now, in Australia, we have the Churchill Trust, and I suspect it's in other countries as well. And this is an opportunity for Australians of various persuasions to go and do some research about a topic of interest, and they package it up, and they've sort of learned the lessons of best practice internationally, and they bring it back to Australia, and they write a report, and they then try to influence government decision making. And I realized that every year there were sort of 20 or 30 Churchill Fellows that came back and published this report. And it was kind of potluck as to whether or not that research that they had done was going to have access to the channels of, you know, power or the corridors of power. So I approached the Churchill Fellowship about partnering with the Centre for Policy Futures at the University of Queensland so that we could take the interactions that we were developing with the public and political sector and their fellows who were doing this outstanding research based on international best practice and say, well, how do you bring the two together? One key aspect of that was something called GRIP training, getting research into policy and practice. And I'm not sure how it works in other countries, but in Australia, we no longer really teach what used to be called civics, you know, which is sort of how the country works, the constitution, the different levels of government, who does what, who's responsible for what, where do taxes go, etc., and who's making decisions when and under what conditions. And so this training was really about taking some of our academics and the Churchill Fellows and saying, this is what decision making looks like, public policy decision making looks like. This is the messiness, this idea of a beautiful policy cycle. I've not seen it. So this is the messiness. And if you have research that is powerful, that you think ought to be heard by decision makers, then this is the messiness that you're going to need to engage with. And of course, lobbyists and advocates and NGOs are really good at it. Academics are not. It's not our forte. And so it was really just, it was an initiative to say, great research, decision makers, they need to meet. We don't need a dating app. What we need is some training that teaches us how that world works, and then package it up and develop a process by which we can get that research in front of decision makers.
Fantastic. I think that's a really, really exciting program, and very hands-on. So I'm sure many people listening to us will have, taken some notes for sure. Karen, I would love to talk now a little more about what you're currently doing in government and also the relationship that you're having with science. You spoke earlier in our conversation about the fact that you in Australia, you have a very structured and systemic way of actually bringing research and scientists into the policymaking process. So I was wondering, when you took on the current role that you're having, were there any institutionalized ways of mechanisms, for engaging, for bringing in scientific evidence into the policymaking cycle?
Yes, there are. And I don't want to for a moment suggest that Australia has a perfect system, but I was certainly heartened by the fact that we have tried and tested methods by which we get the science incorporated into the policymaking process. So just to give you an example, and one that a lot of people will be familiar with, we have a joint agreement between the Australian government and the Queensland government to manage and protect the Great Barrier Reef. And it's governed by something called the Reef 2050 plan. But the Reef 2050 plan was put together by means of a number of different things, but one of which was putting science at the heart of the process, and having an independent expert panel, which is made up of eminent experts in their field, who provide advice to both governments about where the priorities for investment are. We also have a scientific consensus statement which speaks to what the threats are to the Great Barrier Reef and what responses ought to be invested in by governments in order to address those threats. And this is an architecture, a governance architecture that puts science very much at the heart of it, but also puts monitoring and evaluation and reporting at the heart of the program. Which is what you want. So that's just one example. There are sort of ad hoc ways in which science is pulled in by virtue of individual relationships, or by virtue of the establishment of scientific panels which inform the government's thinking about what it should and shouldn't do. But I will say what I used to say before I joined government, because it's probably even more obvious to me now than it was even then, and that is that science is but one input to policy making, and that's as it should be. I don't subscribe to the idea that the science is the single point of truth. It is one input to decision making. It ought to be the best science that's possibly available, that's ground truthed and peer reviewed. But science evolves, values evolve, priorities evolve, and ultimately democracy is messy, and so compromise is needed. And I think that's something that perhaps the scientific community gets frustrated by. It's, well, the science says we should do X. And on COVID, interestingly, we saw in Australia quite a remarkable deference to the science in how we approached the pandemic. It was a delight to watch. But the point being that it is but one input, an unbelievably important input, but not the only input.
Yeah, thanks very much for really pointing out, that importance, which I think is sometimes also difficult for scientists to understand. Also, that it's not really, it's not possible to just take scientific findings and really implement them right away into the policy cycle. On a more personal note, Karen, since you've transitioned from being an academic, to being a government official, what do you find most exciting about your work and your role as policymaker?
Well, I love my colleagues, of course. I'm surrounded by incredibly talented and committed and dedicated public servants. It can be a brutal business working in government. You by definition, you're subject to the priorities of the government of the day. So the team around me is extraordinary. I have to say I quite like the politics. I did study political science, so perhaps that's not surprising. But there is a cut and thrust to working in the upper echelons of government, which is kind of exhilarating. If you're interested in having an impact, then I think being that close to the decision making is quite exciting. And what else? I mean, look, Julia, I've been in the environment and sustainability space for nearly 20 years. And for a lot of that time, you felt like you were really banging your head against a brick wall. But the last couple of years, there's been a massive shift globally, but particularly, I think, in Australia. So it's a joy to be part of processes and conversations and discussions around, how you achieve ecologically sustainable development. It's a joy.
Yeah, I think it's really this notion of, seeing that what you do really has an impact and can really change things on the ground, right?
Yeah, a little bit, not too much. Every now and again you go, oh, that's good. I like that.
All right, Karen, we're coming to the end already. And would like to ask you a final question. Since we're having this conversation in the context of the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, and this notion of creativity in bureaucracy is very important to us. So what do you think, what can creative bureaucracy do in order to sort of help overcome tensions between science and policy making?
Well, that's a good question. Tensions. So if there are tensions, it's probably because of a lack of understanding about each other's perspectives. Right. And ultimately, this is about people. So I think the more that we have, close, honest, frank relationships between the two sectors, the more likely it is that we'll understand each other's perspective. And those tensions may not disappear, but at least they can be explained. So it probably sounds a little bit like a cop-out, but I'm a big believer in communication and people talking to each other and explaining why it is they have the view they have. It can go a long way to alleviating paranoia or frustration or, whatever the tension might be.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's nice that we're closing this conversation with the notion of communication, the importance of communicating between people, since we're all human beings. And really, this is also what unites us and what really brings us closer to one another. So thanks very much, Karen. Thanks very much for being my host on this very last episode of our series, Creative Bureaucracy Meets Science. And it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me.
Goodbye, Karen.